And it is preparing. Prepare away.
Awesome.
I've got a notification that says that it is now streaming live on YouTube.
Excellent. Perfect. Okay, well then let me remember what I'm supposed to be doing here. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to a Jane Austen Christmas. We'll be hearing a talk from Maria Grace, who quite literally wrote the book on the subject. I've actually had a couple readers ask, what do I mean when I say she quite literally wrote the book on the subject? Well, she wrote the book called A Jane Austen Christmas. So she really literally wrote the book on the subject. I don't know if you have a copy of it there, Maria Grace.
I can do a screen share real quick, and that's the book there.
Okay, wonderful. There it is, A Jane Austen Christmas, and that is well known around the world. It's sold in the Jane Austen House Museum and in museums all in the UK. And so she is quite an expert on the subject, and she's given this talk a great many places. Most of you probably know Maria Grace has also written a number of Jane Austen variations and stories, plus her Jane Austen's Dragons series with the Blue Order, because there really must have been dragons in Jane Austen's time. So she's written some other nonfiction Jane Austen in addition to about Jane Austen's times, in addition to Jane Austen's Christmas. She's written a book about Jane Austen and ice cream, and a book about courtship and marriage in Jane Austen's time. So I hope that you will be as interested as I am in Maria Grace's talk here. And we're hoping it will go smoothly, but Maria Grace is having some storms where she is now, so we're a little worried about power. And if power goes out, you'll have to hear me babble about Mummers Plays, which is part of Jane Austen's Christmas. That's been part of my life, and the only thing I might actually know more about Jane Austen's Christmas than Maria Grace does. But hopefully we will just hear Maria Grace. And afterwards, for those who are on Zoom, we will be breaking into small chat rooms so that we can chat with each other and talk about Jane Austen and everything we love about her, and for a little Christmas treat. So with that, I will turn it over to Maria Grace for A Jane Austen Christmas.
All right. And just making sure everybody can see me okay. Do we have that working? Okay. Do we have the video working? Because all I can see is a no camera icon there.
I'm seeing the video delayed. Yes, the video does seem to be working.
Okay, just making sure, because on my end it looked a little bit funny. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and I'll be flipping back and forth with a PowerPoint, just because I think it's nice to have some pretty graphics to stare at rather than stare at me all the time. But I'll kind of flip back and forth a little bit here. All righty. So like Abigail said, this is the book, A Jane Austen Christmas, and it is available on Amazon. And it's the fuller version of what I'm going to be able to talk about this afternoon. If you do have any questions as we're going along, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat. And I know Abigail is keeping an eye on the chat, so please feel free to jump in with what's in the chat room, so we can make sure that we get to talk about what everybody's interested in. So I always like to start this with a discussion of what time period we are actually referring to, because there's a lot of confusion out there about what exactly the Regency period is. Technically, the Regency period was 1811 to 1820, when during the illness of King George III, his son held the Regency, held the throne basically. So that's just a 9-year span, which is a very little tiny sliver of history. So In some instances, when we talk about the Regency era, we're talking about that 9 years and that's it. But as authors, we're usually more looking at the period of cultural influence, which spanned roughly from the end of the French Revolution to the end of King George IV's reign, which again, very roughly is 1790 to 1830. And, you know, there's a little fuzz on either end of those dates. Because in 1830, that's when we get firmly into the Victorian era. The Regency is also known as the end of the Georgian era. And the Georgian era were the reigns of King George I, George II, George III, and guess what? George IV. Kind of get the theme here? It's all the Georges in a row who reigned make up the Georgian era. And that's the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s. So that's the period of time that we're talking about, just to kind of put a pin in it and say, all right, here is where we are in the timeline, because sometimes that can be a little confusing. And it's specifically confusing because the Victorian era, which followed, starting roughly 1830, was really when so many of the Christmas traditions that we think about as Christmas traditions, that we really link with Christmas time, they came about in the Victorian era, not the Regency period. So things like Christmas trees, that really got popularized in the Victorian era, not in Austen's time. So unless someone had German background, Christmas trees were largely unknown during the Regency period, and the typical family would not have had a Christmas tree. Emphasis on family and children especially was very much more Victorian than it was Regency era. Christmas was more of an adult celebration, a grown-up celebration, than it was for all the little kids. That's not to say kids weren't participants in a lot of the family activities, but it wasn't all about the children the way it has become since the Victorian era. So it really had a very, very different feel and very different perspective to it. So it's important to kind of draw that line post-Victorian Christmas and then pre-Victorian Christmas, because things changed dramatically from one of those eras to the next. Does that make sense? I'm going to pretend I see people nodding at me. That's a big thing to get used to with Zoom. I'm so used to having a live audience so I can see facial expressions and body language and all of that. And just kind of, I got 4 pictures, 4 people on the side of my screen here. So the Christmas season in the Regency era didn't have a specific calendar per se, but I kind of used that as a way of identifying dates which may have been of particular meaning to different celebrants. One of the things that's important to realize here is not everybody celebrated the same way. Just like today, different people celebrate Christmas very differently. In my daughter-in-law's family, their big celebration is Christmas Eve. And don't mess with that. Yeah, that is their big family day. They celebrate on Christmas Eve. We usually celebrate Christmas morning. And so there are a lot of little differences just even between our families. So in the same way, when we're talking about these different celebrations and different traditions, it's important to recognize that everybody was different. And probably nobody did every single one of these things. They would do a smattering of things, what was traditionally done in their family or the families that they married into. So this isn't the everybody did this and then they did this and then they did this. This is kind of a, well, some people did this and some people did this, and there was a lot of individual variation. And some of that variation would also relate to social class and how much time and money you had to put aside for celebrations. And we'll touch on that more as we go along. So probably the first thing that might be going on for a Christmas celebration would be Stirred Up Sunday, which was the Sunday before Advent began. So the date would vary year to year, but it was the Sunday before the beginning of Advent. And that was the day that plum puddings would be made. And I'll talk more about plum puddings in a minute, but that's actually a food with 800 years of history attached to it. It's kind of mind-boggling to me to think of a recipe that's pretty much been passed down and utilized in some form or fashion for 800 years. That's a lot of longevity. And of course, there may be a few plum puddings actually that old still around, but that's kind of another story. Following that, as we start getting into Advent, December the 6th is St. Nicholas Day. And it's a day where we might see small gifts being exchanged, particularly to children, but not a huge celebration, just kind of a recognition. It was also the day where a lot of Christmas visiting would begin. One of the big things that happened during the Christmas time season is that you would travel to visit friends and family. And because of the enormous expense, both in time and travel expenses and just wear and tear on the human being, traveling, when you went somewhere, you stayed for a while to make it worth it, to make your trip worth it. So Christmas visits could last weeks, could last a month. And St. Nicholas Day, December the 6th, was a common day for that sort of visiting to begin. December 21st is St. Thomas's Day, and we'll talk in a couple of minutes about some of the charity that was associated with St. Thomas Day. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and then the day after Christmas, called Boxing Day or St. Stephen's Day, followed very rapidly in succession. Christmas Day was really the beginning of the big celebratory season. For us, it marks kind of the end. Well, maybe we go on to New Year's, but that's the big holiday and everything starts winding down after that. In the Regency era, that was the wind up point, starting Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and it wound up for the big celebrations on 12th night, which was 12 days of Christmas. That's where the 12 days of Christmas come from. From Christmas Day to 12th night is a 12-day period that traditionally marks the 12th night marks the visit of the Magi or the wise men to the Christ child. That's traditionally what that day is. It's called Epiphany in some traditions. And that was the big gift-giving celebration in the Regency era. Some gifts might be exchanged at Christmas, but that really wasn't the focus. And the gift-giving focus wasn't nearly what it is today. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different kinds of gifts that were given during this season. New Year's Day kind of falls in between the two. And it, depending on the family, may or may not have a lot of tradition, a lot of celebration about it. There's a lot of variation about how that was celebrated. Any questions before we plunge into all of this? Or anything you specifically want to make sure that we get to talk about? Anything on the chat?
Well, there's some questions talking about when people talk about the Georgian era, and you may want to give just a little background why we call the Georgian era so long. I think Lucy put in there that the Georgian era was actually 1714 to around 1830-ish. And so you may want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's sometimes called the long 18th century because that period lasted from the early 1700s into the 1800s. And it was a period of cultural influence. Again, it was all the Hanoverian, the kings were from the Hanoverian line, and they were all Georges. That's why it gets its name, the Georgian era. This is the period where the French Revolution took place and French society turned inside out. And it had a lot of ramifications into English society as well. So there was a lot happening socially and culturally during that era that set it apart on either end. And the Industrial Revolution that began towards the end of the Georgian era, the beginning of the Victorian era, is one of the markers that marks the transition out of the Georgian era and into the Victorian. Is that help answer?
Yeah, Maria, this is Erna. I was somehow I got the impression, thank you, that you know, I'm trying to get my head around something. I had a misconception for a long time. Then I've always thought the Georgian era ended when the Regency started, maybe. But what I think I'm hearing you say is the Georgian period is the uber definition, Georgian era, and within that is this box of 9 years that when you talk about a Regency novel, you know, well, most of Jane Austen's novels were not, you know, well, a lot of them were written before that period. So yeah, even though they were published later, but yeah, so I guess a lot of the Regency romance novels, so to speak, or Regency novels are not strictly speaking Regency, or saying they were Georgian.
Well, see, that's why I like to draw the difference between the technical Regency was 1811 to 1820 and was just that point where there was a regent on the throne. But the cultural influence, we're talking about the end of the Georgian era, which was more of a 30 to 50 year span, depending on which expert you lean on, that really went into 1820, 1830.
Okay, so then we would call a Regency novel in that window, 1790 to 1830, would be kind of the Regency. Okay, got it. Thank you. That helps.
Yeah, pretty much as readers and writers, that's what we do, because if we limit ourselves to that 9 year span, it's a little constricted.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. Everything is 1816 or something. Yeah,
right.
Little too unbelievable. Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, moving on ahead with looking at our holiday celebrations, plum pudding. Plum pudding is, we can trace it down to the medieval period. We find recipes for puddings of meat and grain back into the medieval era, where your cooking was limited to throwing everything into a pot and letting it sit for a long time. Because ovens and a lot of the other things that we just take for granted in the kitchen really weren't available. So that's where we see the beginnings of plum pudding, and the traditions started to form around it. It was definitely, in some cases, a celebratory sort of thing. It involved dried fruits, which could be expensive, and alcohol. And so it became a celebratory kind of dish. By the 1600s, it was typically served with a brandy flambe to bring it out at Christmas time, at the winter solstice. And it was very much a spectacle, very dramatic, which kind of set off Oliver Cromwell, who found it way too pagan for his tastes. And in the 1600s, Cromwell and his associates basically outlawed plum pudding and a lot of the Christmas time celebrations. And they were just set aside, and it was illegal to celebrate Christmas. George I, remember we've been talking about this line of Georges? George I in 1714 requested plum pudding as part of the meal for the first Christmas celebration of his reign. So he was sometimes called the Pudding King because he brought back plum pudding into Christmas time celebrations. And so it's very much now tied into Christmas celebrations. Preparing plum pudding, although most households had their own particular recipe that would be handed down from generation to generation, a lot of recipes in the era, although cookbooks were printed, and one of my favorite collections, I have a bunch of electronic duplicates of period cookbooks, and I love to dig through them. One thing, though, that happened was families would write down recipes. Women would have household books, and they'd record their recipes, and they would be handed down from generation to generation to generation. And something like plum pudding was very much a family dish, and so each family had their own particular way of making it. which would be handed down from grandmother to granddaughter and so forth. Most of the recipes had some commonality. They included things like chopped suet, currants, raisins, dried fruit, eggs, flour, milk, spices, and brandy. Now, one of the traditions with making plum pudding would be that there would be 13 ingredients, 13 separate ingredients, and the family would gather around the huge bowl, and each would add one of the 13 ingredients. The dish would be stirred up with a wooden spoon, which was symbolic of the manger that Christ was born in, and it was always stirred from east to west in reference to the direction of the journey of the Magi. So there were a lot of traditions about the way that it would be made. After all of this was stirred together, a lot of families had a set of charms that would be stirred into the pudding. Now, in the era, the charms might be lead or nickel, which often had a lot of, or pewter rather, which had lead in it, which just kind of, sets off my modern sensibilities. You're putting lead in your plum pudding. And then, there's quite a bit of alcohol in it as well. So, we might have a little bit of toxicity involved. But the charms were part of the celebration when it was served. If you got a charm in your plum pudding and, hopefully didn't break a tooth on it in the process, that charm was an indicator of your fortune for the year. So if you found a coin, and some families used the charm, some families just used coins, some families didn't do it at all. But a coin would be symbolic of prosperity, where a ship might signify travel, a thimble symbolized spinsterhood. In some families, they tied it to hard work or thrift instead, because that was kind of a hard way to start your year, with a thimble in your plum pudding. There would be a ring many times, which would symbolize that person would get married during the year. So you had that aspect with the plum pudding as well. After it was all mixed up, you would turn it out into a pudding cloth, and the illustration on your screen on the left-hand side is a pudding cloth that has the plum pudding in it that is tied up and hung on a hook to dry. Now, keep in mind, we're in November doing this, and it's going to sit around and dry and soak in alcohol for the next several weeks before we serve it at Christmas time. So we've got a good month, 6 weeks to a month of aging and soaking that goes into this plum pudding. So it's getting dense and often soaked in rum and brandy. So it tends to be very well preserved. I've had a couple of these. When they get opened up, the brandy fumes or the rum fumes are just, okay, yes, we know the plum pudding has been opened. They're really noticeable. And it was brought in on a large platter at the end of dinner, and the more theatrical hostesses would snuff out most of the candles in the room. Now dining rooms had a lot of mirrors and crystal as a rule. And the purpose of that was to reflect light, to make them brighter without using more candles, because candles were very expensive. And so you had a lot of crystals and mirrors in the room to help make it brighter. So they would snuff out the candles, or most of the candles, light the plum pudding soaked in brandy, and bring it in on a silver platter. So you had these remarkable blue frames. Brandy burns at a low temperature and it burns blue. So you had this glowing blue plum pudding coming in on a silver platter, and you'd have that light reflected all through the dining room, which is a color of light that is going to be very unusual for the era. It's not like you can get Christmas lights in that color. They didn't exist. The brandy blue is a lot like blue Christmas lights. It's that kind of a tone. So it's a very unique and special kind of color. So it was very theatrical and very celebratory when they would bring the plum pudding in as the close to the big Christmas dinner. But it was a 6-week process to create this thing in order to be able to serve it for Christmas dinner. One question that comes up all the time is, why was it called plum pudding? Because if, I ran through the ingredient list really, really fast, I know, but it was called plum pudding, not because there were plums in it, but because it contained prunes, dried plums, and raisins, other dried fruit, which were referred to as plum in the era. So because it contained the prunes and the raisins and all of that, it was referred to as plum pudding because those were referred to as plums. And that's how it got its name, even though it doesn't seem to make sense to us today. Now, I mentioned St. Thomas's Day and Christmastide Charity. Christmas was, and if there are any questions on plum pudding, just jump in and holler out. Christmas season involved a lot of charity. One of the most notable things were the Mumpers, who were widows and spinsters who would come around on St. Thomas's Day asking for donations towards their Christmastide celebrations. Very often they would bring a pot for wheat because wheat was extremely expensive during the period. And they would go to wealthy homes and ask for a donation of wheat or perhaps some coins towards their Christmas feast. This era, because of the Napoleonic Wars, there were a tremendous number of widows in Regency England due to the Napoleonic Wars. So it was not unusual for every community to have a few widows who needed help and support, because in the period, it was extremely difficult for women to work, particularly if there were any children involved. There were not a lot of career opportunities for women, especially if they had any children in tow. So they really did need the support of their families and oftentimes their communities. In exchange for the gifts, they would often offer mistletoe or holly sprigs as an exchange of gifts in gratitude for what was given to them. Gifts in the Regency era Christmastide, there were personal gifts certainly exchanged between equals and family members and that kind of thing. But there were a lot of gifts of obligation, which were part of the season. Charitable gifts were one side of those gifts of obligation. So supporting the poor in the community, especially for landowners and the wealthy citizens in a particular community. Austen wrote about this when she talked about Miss Bates, Miss and Mrs. Bates in Emma. One of the things we often see in Emma is that she would bring pork and apples and gifts of food to the Bates. That was charitable giving and was considered part of the obligation in many respects of being a landowner or a leader in the community, that you supported those in need, the deserving poor, so to speak. That was more of a Victorian term, but the idea was still kind of there. Other gifts of obligation went the other direction. So there were gifts of obligation from the tenants to the landowner. There were gifts of obligation from shopkeepers to their customers. During Michaelmas, oftentimes tenants would present a goose to the landowner. So we had gifts of obligation that kind of went both ways. They were just cultural expectations of the era. that are a little different than how we see Christmas time today. And the personal gifts were usually more like the 12th night gifts that we would see. And very often they would be homemade rather than purchased. That's not to say there weren't purchased as well, but there, particularly women were apt to do handmade gifts. I hear voices. Is that something I need to pay attention to?
I'll try and figure that out.
Okay, thanks. I just don't want to miss anything. Another thing that we would see during the Christmas era, Abigail mentioned mummers plays and sword dancers. Since that's a particular area of research and familiarity for you, why don't you say a few words on that, Abigail?
Oh, okay. Well, what I can tell you is my husband was a Morris dancer for many, many years and was a sword dancer, danced on a sword team that did produced that kind of sword star that you see there. And the teams always did mummers plays, and I was in the mummers plays a number of years. Mummers plays have a very standard setup for them. They're generally St. George fighting the dragon, St. George being injured, and then St. George being resuscitated by the doctor. And there are lines, familiar lines that run through all the different scripts, but they're different in different locations, and they're always changed according to the politics. This year, the local revels here in Woods Hole are doing a COVID-based mummers play, and you think this is a modern thing. No. They would have been poking fun of the Prince Regent in the mummers plays in Jane Austen's time. The tradition of bringing modern politics and situations into the mummers plays goes way, way back. But at the same time, there's a strong traditional component to them that tells the story. And as you tell it, there are things that the audience participates in. For example, when the doctor is called in to resurrect St. George, he has some famous lines in there. The person calling him in says, "Well, doctor, what can you cure?" And the doctor says, "I can cure the itch, the stitch, the palsy, and the gout, the pains within and the pains without." There's like variations on that in different locations. But if you go to a revels, just like where people know mummers plays, it would have been just like in Jane Austen's time. The entire audience jumps in on these lines, like at the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Everyone knows the lines, they all jump in. So it becomes a whole community event, this mummers play, because we know the mummers play and all the lines in it. But it's a Christmas tradition, and it would be people in the village who would come together and put together the mummers play each year from the traditional ones, and then they put in their own things and they poke fun at each other. And I'm not sure what to put on top of that. I didn't really have anything prepared, but.
Yeah, sorry for catching you flat-footed. I just thought, it'd be great to hear your firsthand experiences on that.
Well, I can throw in one. In one case, I was a doctor. I was often cast as a doctor because, well, I was a doctor and I had all the props. And in one, they rewrote it so that when I took out all my instruments to do the things, which were everything from kitchen appliances to traditional stethoscope and whatnot, I brought out a stuffed cat, and added to the things I did was a cat scan where I picked up this stuffed cat and ran it along St. George while the entire crew behind me for the cat scan. So, but they're a lot of fun. They're not a traditional play where you're getting entertained because everyone knows the entire story. So, but it's a great celebration. And if you ever have a chance to attend a revels near you, you'll see sword dancers, you'll see mummers plays, and they really haven't changed a great deal since Jane Austen's time, or even since early medieval times.
Thank you. What you're describing with the Mummers play is very much like the pantomime, and I'm kind of skipping ahead, and I'll catch back up with what we're jumping over, but the pantomimes had a lot in common with what you're describing as the Mummers play doing. Pantomimes usually started on the day after Christmas. That was the traditional day for pantomimes to begin, and these were theater events that could involve the whole family. And even though we think of pantomime today as being silent, they were anything but silent. These were plays that, like with the Mummers plays, involved a lot of audience reaction and interaction. This was not something you sat silently and watched. The audience would often call out, during a chase scene, oh, he's behind the barrel, or he's, behind the tree. They would boo the villains and cheer the heroes. And there could be a lot of political overtones in this, depending on who wrote it. The traditional pantomime, just like with the Mummers play, involved a core story. In this case, it was the story of Harlequin on the left on the screen there, and Columbine, his love interest, and her father, who was Pantaloon, who was trying to make Columbine marry a wealthy suitor that she had no interest in. She was in love with Harlequin, who the father was trying to keep her away from. That was the basic storyline. And there would be a big chase scene that used a lot of in-era special effects, a lot of gymnastics that the audience expected, and it would be very active, very loud. But in the end, Harlequin always gets Columbine. They always end up together at the end. Instead of having regional differences the way the Mummers did, in pantomimes, they would put another story in combination with the Harlequin story. So something like Cinderella and the Harlequin, or Robinson Crusoe and Harlequin. And so they would kind of combine those two stories. They would start out in the story world of Robinson Crusoe or Cinderella or what have you. And then a magic fairy would come in and move them into the world of the Harlequin, and we'd see all the things that the audience expected. It was something that you brought children to. Oh, okay, sorry, my phone made a very strange noise. I didn't know what it was, but it sounded very theatrical. Children were expected to be at the pantomime, but there were a lot of lines aimed at the adults over the children's head. So the children might be innocently enjoying things while there were risque innuendos and political statements being made in the dialogue as well, just like we would see in the Mummers plays. So there were a lot of things going on, a lot of layers to these productions. And they were one of the things that people would look forward to on Boxing Day, which is the beginning of the Regency era Christmastime celebrations. So that would be something families would look forward to doing, going to see the pantomime at the start, kind of marking the beginning of the real Yuletide revels. Does that make sense? So there are a lot of fun celebratory things like this that would go on. Which, a lot of these things we don't get to do so much anymore. And I don't know, I think it would be fun to do some of these things. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Christmas caroling did happen, but it was a little bit different than it is today. Initially, going all the way back to Shakespeare, caroling kind of began with lower class men singing from house to house. And they could get pretty rowdy and boisterous, and homeowners sometimes just paid them off to get them off the property. So it's not exactly, the origins we might have thought for caroling. By the end of the 18th century, moving into the Regency era, Carolers were usually groups of working class men and women who went from house to house looking for houses with a candle in a window. The candle in the window was a symbol that carolers were wanted. And so they would be friendly. They would carol at the house and receive sometimes coins, wassail, food, as thanks for their efforts in entertainment. Typically, caroling parties would end up at the manor house. If they were in a village where there was an estate, they would end up at the manor house. And this would be one of those hospitality obligation moments for the master and mistress of the estate to bring in the carolers and offer punch, wassail, snacks, and so forth in thanks and appreciation for them bringing the carols. I mentioned having candles in the window as a sign that carolers were wanted. Lights were one part of the decoration of the festive season. Certainly we'd see candles in the window, and since candles were the basic form of light, we'd see them in a lot of places. Christmas decorations, and these are taken from, and I wish I had made myself a note of what house these were taken from, but it's a manor house decorated in a traditional Regency fashion. The predominant decorations are greenery, and they can be greenery tied in garlands, as we see, like draped on the fireplace here or over the picture, sprigs placed on the table, vases with greenery, holly berries, Christmas roses, sprigs tied together and hung up on the walls. Red bows were very typical. Houses would be decorated on Christmas Eve. That was the traditional day to do decorating. So where, this year, some of us were looking at October thinking that's a really good time to get Christmas decorations out for 2020. Let's just, get right to it. Holiday decorations didn't come out until the day before Christmas, Christmas Eve. And they would stay out until 12th night. And traditionally, they needed to be burned by the end of 12th night, or you would be inviting a goblin in for each sprig that remained up and unburnt by the end of 12th night. So you want to talk about a serious homeowners association issue. Ours get a little crazy 2 weeks after Christmas, but they're not threatening us with goblins. But in the era, most of these things would be taken down and burned by midnight on 12th night. Depending on where you lived, if you were out in the country, there would be gathering parties to go out and bring in greenery into the household to make all these decorations with. If you lived in the city and didn't have access to gather it your own, people would bring it in from the country and sell it. So you could buy the greenery even if you didn't have access to find it yourself. I made mention at the beginning here of the plum pudding at the end of the Christmas feast. And here's an image that's probably the housekeeper here. I can't really tell, given how she's, oh, sorry about that. Given how she's dressed, I don't think that looks like the mistress of the manor. So that may be the housekeeper bringing it in lieu of the mistress of the manor, but it's a flaming plum pudding for the end of the Christmas feast. But there were some foods that were very traditional for Christmas. Boar's head was one of them. And the traditions around boar's head relate to the fact that wild boars are very dangerous. If you live in a part of country where you get wild boar, and actually we do, oddly enough, we've had it in our neighborhood, and they're kind of scary, dangerous creatures. But ours aren't even true wild boars, they're just feral. The boar's head symbolized triumph over evil. And so it was served as part of the holiday celebration. they were extinct in England by the time we got to the Regency. So just a common pig's head would do, but it would be roasted with the apple in its mouth, and it would be one of the big centerpiece dishes for a Christmas dinner. Goose was another important dish for Christmas dinner. And one of the things that's really interesting about goose is to roast a goose, you need an oven. Not all houses had ovens, and if they did, they weren't necessarily very large. So many times you couldn't fit the goose in your oven at home. So how do you get a roast goose for Christmas? Well, intrepid bakers came to the rescue, and very oftentimes bakers would take orders for roast Christmas goose. So you would put in your order for roast Christmas goose. You would go to Christmas services first thing in the morning, and then as you're walking home, you walk past the baker and you pick up your roast goose on the way home, and you had takeout goose for dinner. So many times that was the way families would supply at least that part of their Christmas dinner, by getting it from the local baker, because they had large commercial ovens of the day that could supply the foods, the space to roast the goose. After Christmas dinner wrapped up, oftentimes you had a lot of leftovers. Now, keep in mind the challenge of leftovers when there's no refrigeration. You needed to do something with those to try to get the most out of them without them going bad. So very often, mincemeat pies, known as Christmas pies or Twelfth Night pies, would be made from the leftovers from the Christmas dinner. And they would be eaten for up to 2 months afterwards, but really they were a big part of the traditional foods of that 12-night period. And it was considered particularly good luck to eat a pie every day for those 12 nights, preferably offered by a friend. Friends gave friends pies. And those pies should be eaten in silence. And that was one of the ways to ensure good luck in the coming season. Boxing Day, which was the day after Christmas, was another day where we see a lot of gifts of obligation being given. It was called Boxing Day, not because people went out and bought boxes of stuff, but rather you would prepare, particularly the wealthy families, would prepare boxes of used clothes and food and those kinds of useful items to give to servants and tradesmen that they did business with. A lot of times they would have something of an open house where the tradesmen would come in and pick up their boxes. Servants would be typically given Boxing Day off because they spent Christmas at work serving in the master's house. And so they'd be given their box and then they'd have the day off. So that's where it gets the name Boxing Day. And then finally on 12th night, we get to the really big celebration. 12th night revels, 12th night parties were very common, and they were really big parties. They involved a special 12th night cake that was elaborate with sugar work in it. Very often there was a king and queen assigned, and that might be assigned as a character. It might be from finding the bean and the pea in the 12th night cake. Kind of depends on the family's traditions. Many times 12th night balls were in costume, and those costumes could be derived from a site of 12th night characters that stationery shops would print, and the hostess could buy a set of characters and assign them to people to come in character, or maybe just have them play that character when they came in. The bottom line is these parties got really, really out of hand. They had the potential with lots of punch, which was extremely alcoholic, parlor games, and being in costume in the era was a dangerous, risky activity. Concealing your identity and pretending to be someone you're not had a lot of intrigue associated with it, and kind of brought out a level of merrymaking that might not be seen otherwise. The parties got so raucous, though, that by 1870, Queen Victoria outlawed them because they were so out of control. So instead of being these very well-mannered kind of events, they could definitely be like what we think of New Year's celebrations today. And that kind of brings me to the end of my time slot here. So I want to throw open to any questions, thoughts, comments before we break out into our breakout groups.
Well, when you talk about 12th night, Louisiana and the Mardi Gras carnival situation took it up to a whole nother level. So we can see a lot of the genesis of some of the traditions from the carnival season from Mardi Gras, particularly in the 12th night situation. Ball mask, the cake with the charms inside, someone being chosen as the queen of the event based on who pulls out a particular charm out of the cake. So a lot of these things are traditions that are throughout Christianity in Europe. England, in its Protestant traditions, had their ways of doing things. More Catholic communities, particularly in southern Germany and France, put a little different spin on it. But it's rather universal. But it's still very interesting to see how the English did these basic, kind of almost European type traditions in and around Christmas.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how many commonalities there are across different cultures and how they each put a slightly different spin on it.
It was interesting for me when I wrote A Matter of Honor, which is set in Scotland, which when Cromwell outlawed the celebration of Christmas, that continued in Scotland. They did not start celebrating Christmas in Scotland at all until the 1950s. And that word 19 is correct. It was the 1950s. Before then, Christmas was an ordinary work day. It's just fascinating to look at this. We do have a question from YouTube from Veronica Bailey, who would like to know if there's a difference between plum pudding and figgy pudding, and as we hear about in the carols. And I just want to throw in something about plum pudding for anyone who hasn't had it. If you're an American who's never tasted it, you're probably tempted to try this out. Don't. If you grew up with it, I'm sure it's delicious. But if you've never had it before, you will be sorely disappointed. It's beautiful. It's stunning. It's genuine, and it's awful. I'll eat almost any dessert, but I won't make it through a serving of plum pudding.
I have to agree with you. I've tried it, and I have not been able to get past the first spoonful myself.
Yes.
I can't speak for plum. Okay.
Plum pudding and figgy pudding are basically the same thing.
I can't speak.
Go ahead.
No, you're talking about plum pudding. That puts in my mind haggis, and maybe I've been lucky, but I actually like it. But that's just me.
You like haggis or plum pudding?
Yes, haggis.
I have not tried it. I confess I haven't tried it.
Maybe I was really lucky. I had a gentleman who made it himself. He was from Scotland, and we had his dinner party. And he says, we're gonna have a true Scottish dinner. And certainly he brought out the haggis. Now he said, go ahead and try it, see if you like it. I got seconds. I liked it. But then, Louisiana, we come up with boudin and hoghead cheese and a bunch of other things that a lot of people aren't going to eat. So it could be part of that.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
How does plum pudding compare to fruitcake?
They're very similar, and they share a lot of the same flavor palette and a lot of the same ingredients. The biggest difference between plum pudding and fruitcake is the way that heat is applied. Fruitcake is baked, and so you get a bready texture. Plum pudding is steamed or boiled. So you wrap it in a cloth and you put in a cauldron for 4 or 5 hours, depending on how big this thing is. And as a result, it gives you a different kind of texture. The best analogy I can give you is the difference between a biscuit and a dumpling, a boiled dumpling.
Also, plum pudding is made with suet rather than butter.
Yeah.
And it kind of tastes like suet. Sorry, it
Yeah.
does.
Even vegan versions of plum pudding are disgusting. Just putting it out there. I've never had a traditional one. So I don't think it's just a suet.
Maybe if they put bacon in instead, it'll taste better.
There's a thought.
That's an interesting thought. Don't say it too loudly, because I got a son who would just try it for funsies. But it's interesting how traditional holiday foods in all cultures can be a little bit like, ew, not too sure about that, for those coming from outside cultures. You know, those flavors that speak holiday and home in one place often kind of come across as, oh, I'm not too sure about that from other cultures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, how about lutefisk from Norway?
There you go.
It's an acquired taste.
Yes. Having lived in Wisconsin many years, it's a very, very acquired taste. And with 3 or 4 lifetimes, I'm sure I could acquire it.
I was too scared to even try it when I lived in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's definitely one I have not jumped into myself.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'd first like to thank Maria Grace very much for sharing with us all this information about a Jane Austen Christmas. I do want to mention that she's also written some Jane Austen, some Pride and Prejudice variations set in the Christmas season, including Twelfth Night at Longbourn, where you can learn more about the Twelfth Night Christmas traditions. And now you will all know a great deal more as you read a book set in this period. So, and we decided that after this we would do short breakouts to allow us a little time to chat with each other and visit. And so I'll be setting that up. But before I do, I just like to mention that we do have JAF in January coming up. Some of you may have attended our JAF in June event, where we got together a bunch of the Austen Variations authors, and we did everything from little plays to lectures to chatting with each other and generally making fools of ourselves, but having a really good time interacting with our readers and building community. And we're going to do that again in January. Hopefully that will provide some distraction from what may be a difficult season for many of us. So we hope you'll come for that. That'll be January 9th and 10th. We don't have the precise date. It looks like we'll have some watch parties with that as well, but I don't have any details on that. So keep watching this space and you'll hear more about JAF in January coming up. I know that Maria Grace and her narrator are going to be doing a piece from her next dragon book. And that's something I'm looking forward to. And now, first of all, I'm going